this part of human anatomy videos, we'll be talking about the base of the skull. So firstly, I wanted to show you the entire base of the skull, seeing it a little bit more from a distance, but with the proper light, which I believe I have, it's going to be very easy for us to demonstrate that the base of the skull is not flat. It is actually depressed at 3 different levels. So as a result of this, we're going to form 3 different depressions: the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and what we see at the back, the posterior cranial fossa. So let's take a look a little bit closer to each of these 3 individual cranial fossae, and let's find out bones that are important to build them. Let's go first with the anterior cranial fossa. As one can see, it is oriented to the front of the cranial vault, and also it appears to be the most superiorly elevated out of 3 fossae. There are 2 major bones that are responsible to form it. Essentially we can say 3, but let's point out first, this part is the orbital part of the frontal bone. So the frontal bone practically makes a 90-degree turn and sends a horizontal or relatively thin plate that forms the superior roof of the orbit. Further posteriorly, the orbital part of the frontal bone is met and joined with the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone, and they will form a very fine suture that will make it quite difficult to recognize exactly at which point these 2 bones have fused together. Since the frontal bone develops from 2 different halves, there will be a deep U-shaped notch in between 2 halves of the frontal bone, and this is going to be an opportunistic moment for the 3rd bone to fit in between left and right half of the frontal bone, and of course here we recognize the ethmoid bone. That little light that shines through is because we're seeing the horizontally oriented plate, the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, through which fibers of cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve fibers, go from cranial vault into upper third of the nasal space, and of course are responsible for bringing special sensation of smell. The perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone is also visible here, and of course this big massive projection is what we call the crista galli. So the posterior margin of the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone, including the posterior clinoid processes, are very nicely marking the exact posterior boundary of the anterior cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa is seen here or here. We have, of course, 2 of them, one on the left, one on the right side, and bones that are responsible to mark the boundaries again are the posterior wings of the sphenoid bones, lesser wings, of the sphenoid bone, and here we have the petrous part of the temporal bone, which separates middle from the posterior cranial fossa. The middle cranial fossa will have quite a large number of different openings, and we will address them in the next couple of minutes of this video. These are openings that will be quite important for a large number of cranial nerves, as well as for structures that are trying to get into the skull. Middle cranial fossa houses the temporal lobe of the cerebrum, and I forgot to mention it a little bit earlier, but it's not late to do it now. It is left and right-sided frontal bones of the cerebrum that will sit and be supported by the anterior cranial fossa. Finally, the posterior cranial fossa, last out of 3, the lowest positioned of the 3 fossae, and also very clearly marked by this superior running margin or ridge of the petrosal part of the temporal bone, whereas the bulk of the posterior cranial fossa is still responsibility of the occipital bone, which has been described on one of the previously released videos. The posterior cranial fossa again will allow appearance of brain stem that will pass through foramen magnum of the occipital bone and of course both medulla, pons, as well as midbrain or mesencephalon will be situated within this part of the posterior cerebral cranial fossa. Posterior attachment to the brain stem will be two cerebellar hemispheres, and this area in a living specimen of course is going to be sealed with a reflection of dura, or better to say the duplication of dura, that will be attached circumferentially around the margins of the posterior cranial fossa, leaving here just one U-shaped notch in order to allow that midbrain